Chapter 4. I am getting used to the routine. In the first week home from hospital, I took on a full-time nursing role which I embraced with enthusiasm. I had no idea what I was doing. I can do kindness and listening. I can do gliding about in silence. I can do housework, laundry, bed changing. But I found the drugs confused me with long names, tiny instructions, and knowing that not only were they vital for Mum's comfort and treatment, but getting it wrong could be absolutely dreadful. Mother first went into hospital in pain, fatigued, but otherwise normal. Aged 85, we thought tiredness was part of the deal, but the pain we hadn't an answer for. 2 weeks later, a thin, yellow and weak mother was helped home from hospital with her diagnosis of an aggressive pancreatic cancer to a hospital bed in her dining room, where she would wait for her life to wind itself up and out. In the hospital, she heard the news of her cancer with relief. It explained so much, and it meant that there would be no more struggle to keep going. Mother always keeps going. She has been efficient, practical, clever, and seemingly tireless all her life. She used to go to bed early when I was growing up, and I remember going in to say goodnight to her in her bed and thinking that this is just the wrong way to be. It was wrong to go to bed and to be so tired at 9 in the evening. It felt like defeat and old age. But Mother had been up since dawn, keeping the house going, keeping 4 children going, and keeping her husband going, quite apart from coping with a failing marriage and the onset of deep depression. To be up and about, to be making decisions and getting things done was who she was, and we, her 4 children, had no conception that she could be any other way. If she complained of tiredness, we were nice to her, but we let her rest so that her tiredness would pass and life would go on as we expected it to. Mother would rally. If we all let her go to bed at 9 in the evening, that was all she needed to carry on being Mum the next day. We could handle that. Looking back over the past year, as Mum entered her 86th year, she began to slow down faster than at any other time. Her tiredness became fatigue, her appetite shrank, and her inability to stir herself to get into her car and drive off to play bridge began to concern her. We, her children, were sorry to hear it and carried on as usual. We are awfully nice to her, and my older brother took her on holidays. We all took her out for meals, and I came to clean her house once a week, which became once a month because I was so busy. We would aim to fit her into our busy schedules somehow, and we never questioned that she would love to see us because she is our mother, and we, all of us in our 50s, are still her children. Now, when I look back over the last year, I can see that she has been struggling to tell us that something was very wrong without knowing what it was herself. She always looked so well, even when her fatigue made her skin grey. Her hair was white and fluffy, her lipstick in place, and her eyes, though exhausted from time to time, were still deeply intelligent. "I cannot go on like this," she would say, and then she would add, "I will be fine soon. I can't expect to be full of energy at 85. "Yes," we would say, "yes, that's true." And we left it at that. Looking back, my older brother Rafe had noticed that she had changed on one of the holidays he had arranged for her. "She is different," he said. "Something is happening." He was right. When I took a message from one of Mother's friends, a frantic call asking me where I could possibly be, as my mother had been taken into hospital that afternoon, I still did not think it was too serious. When I eventually got to the hospital, she was not expected to stay long, but her stomach was so painful, she felt so sick, and her exhaustion was so intense that something had to be done. A little later, I spoke to my oldest brother Rafe on the phone, and he told me it was cancer. It had not been diagnosed formally, he said, but Mother knew and had told him. 10 days in hospital, 10 days of jaundice, pain, diagnosis and rest, and we were able to take her back to her home. In those 10 days, the palliative care team made themselves known to Mum, to us, and had introduced us to the Macmillan team. Mother was serene. "I don't have to worry," she said. "All my struggle is over. I don't have to fight anymore." When I was about 10 years old, I was running along the top of a small wall somewhere in Bourneville, Birmingham, ahead of my grandmother as she walked slowly on the pavement behind. "Hurry up, Grandma," I called, and she stopped and put her hands on her stomach and told me that she couldn't go fast anymore, that there was something wrong with her tummy. There was a big pain in there. In the way that children do, with insights that we have no name for, I knew that this was different, and what was stopping Grandma from keeping up with me was not going to go away. I thought no more about it until a little while later, when in the November I came home from school to find that she had died during the day. I had turned 11 in the summer, and what had hurt her tummy in the spring had taken her life in the winter. I don't remember Grandma struggling and resisting her illness either. My mother must have watched and learned something from her about how to do this dying thing. Here in Petworth, for my own mother's return from hospital after her diagnosis of pancreatic cancer, Alexia and I had a hospital bed delivered, and we arranged with friends and family to take the huge oak dining table and chairs from her downstairs sitting room to be stored in her garage. The hospital bed, the bedside table and the commode were set up where the large oak table had been, and Mother came home. She was smaller, weaker, and unable to walk. We helped her in and showed her the bed, the flowers, the scented candles, and the lovely nightdress all ready for her. Onto her pillow, Alexia had placed her favourite rosary beads, and these she gently picked up and held in her hand, perhaps for courage, perhaps for acceptance, perhaps for both. We had nappies for her too, little, strong old lady nappies. When Steve was dying, at the end, I found some children's pull-ups, nappies for overnight use for up to 11 years of age, upstairs in one of my son's rooms. They fitted him, and I was both delighted at my practical thinking and horrified at how my beloved partner was wearing my youngest child's nappies as he did his dying in my house. Mother put hers on without a word and lay down in her new bed and closed her eyes. When I brought Steve back to my house from the hospital to await a place in the hospice, I had to pack him into the car with pillows and blankets. He was a week from his own death, but we did not know that. He was unable to walk, he was exhausted, he was skeletal, and he was yellow. He could barely hold his head up. His weakness meant that he could not right himself if he leant too far towards me when I drove round a corner. So I had to pack him into the car with soft padding and cushions. When we arrived at my house, my friend Eileen, who had arrived to take over and help me in the house and with the children, had made the sitting room into his bedroom with candles, flowers, fairy lights, and the softest of beds on the sofa. Between us, we got tall, thin, exhausted and jaundiced Steve to the door of the sitting room from the car. We had a wheelchair from the car to the front door, and the rest of the way from the front door to the door of the sitting room, he held onto my shoulders from behind and leant on me as he tried to make his legs work. I more or less dragged him into the house. At the door of the sitting room, when he saw the room that Eileen had prepared, he stood up from behind me on his own, without support for a moment, and sighed with pleasure and delight. "A paradise," he said, "a paradise." When Mum came back from the hospital to die and saw her bed in the dining room with all the flowers and the lovely cotton sheets and pillowcases, the scented candles and the lovely nightdress ready for her to slip into, she, like Steve, stood still for a moment and smiled. "Paradise," she said, "a paradise." After Mother came back home from the hospital that first time after her diagnosis, the Macmillan nurse bought a lot of medicines. She bought medicines to give Mum daily and medicines to be kept for the end. We put those in a box, and Alexia, a nurse herself, labelled and sorted out which was for daily use and which we should keep in the box for when she was at the very end. Mother gave us an old, small, antique wooden box to use. It was given to her by her mother-in-law, my Nana, with 4 small, engraved, fragile and decorated glass decanters inside. We took out the decanters and put in a syringe driver, morphine, needles, and a do not resuscitate order. That box is to be kept for later when the end stage comes and the syringe driver is needed, we were told. Mother said to put it behind the chair next to her bed for now, which we did. The boxes of medication that Mother needs daily now had to be set out so that I could deal with the long, complicated brand names and the instructions in tiny writing on each packet. We put them in a basket on an antique wicker and wooden chair with an embroidered cushion on the seat. I found a small bone china dish with pretty leaf patterns on it, in which to put her pills, and we found a tiny cut glass tumbler for Mum to use for the soda water that she craved. The first days passed in a blur of not knowing what to expect. What does a yellow 85-year-old with pancreatic cancer do? I slept with my door open and tried to see a pattern emerge. At first, Mother could get up from her hospital bed downstairs in the dining room and walk slowly to the downstairs loo. She could put on her dressing gown and shuffle into the conservatory. Sometimes she was hungry and wanted tiny, tempting dishes of something nice. Other times she was nauseous and full of pain. Early one morning, just after she had come home from the hospital, I heard her crying. Coming downstairs, I found her standing barefoot in her nightdress, bereft and shaking in the hallway, calling my name. "I thought you had gone," she said. "I thought you had left me." I held her very close and asked her to come back from wherever her mind had taken her. I am very much taller than my mother, and her head fits nicely under my chin. "I am still here," I said, "and I won't leave you on your own." Sitting her back in bed, she cried like a child, desperate tears, and talked of abandonment. "I am here," I kept saying. "I won't abandon you. I am here." When she stopped, She put her arms around me and told me she loved me. Then she fell asleep. If we all have such a thing as a soul wound, my mother's is abandonment. She told me once that after she was born, her mother became dangerously ill. Mother was the fourth child of 8, 7 of whom survived, born into a family with little money in the small house in Franklin Road in Birmingham. They put me in a cot out of the way on the piano, she said. My mother needed urgent nursing, and they forgot about me. I think my grandma's sister came over from Ireland to help and looked after the new baby too. In the way these things work out, during the war, Mother went to live with this aunt of hers in Ireland, a childless aunt, with the same love of beautiful things and quality in all she owned that Mother has. The aunt was the love of my mother's life. Last year, Mother and I went back to Ireland to do a grand tour of the relatives there, and we saw the house in which she lived with her beloved aunt. Mother stood for a long time in the tiny kitchen. My mother's cousin is the local parish priest, and as such knows everyone for miles in the area. He took us to knock on the door of this cottage to ask the lady who lives there now if we could go inside to see. This lady was delighted and listened attentively as Mother described her life in the house as it had been in the 1930s, with just herself, her aunt, and the aunt's disreputable husband. Mum stood a long time in the kitchen, lost in thought. Leaving the house a little while later, she paused at the door and, smiling, looked out over the fields at an abandoned and dilapidated farmhouse over the road in the field opposite. She named the people that had lived there. She told us of their lives in the old house and how the children had been her friends. We were silent for a brief while. Here is history, I thought. Times past, times gone, not regretted, remembering for a moment with an old lady reliving her childhood in Ireland on seeing an old and empty broken house across a field as it was once when full of life, and she had had a part in the life of it. Back in Mother's house in Petworth now, by Mother's bedside downstairs in the dining room, I had watched the nurse fill an oral syringe with oromorph, morphine for pain and discomfort, which I have seen used at the hospice where I volunteer. "This is how you do it," the nurse said, "and here," she said, "are plenty of oral syringes. They are just like the ones I used for my children as babies when they took Calpol." "Fine," I said. And nightly I would fill a syringe for Mother and leave it for her to use at bedtime, and one for the night. Within days of coming home, she began to feel sick and to vomit everything, every drop of water that passed her lips, everything that was in her stomach, and then to vomit bile. We were prescribed some very strong anti-sickness pills, which the carers who came in twice daily picked up from the chemist. Half of a tablet in the morning and half in the evening, the instructions said. And then came the morphine patches, on prescription and delivered to the door. We put one on Mother's arm. She took half of the sickness pill at bedtime, with the usual oromorph in the oral syringes and her usual sleeping tablet that she had on prescription and for which she had been given the go-ahead to continue to take with all the other medication that was now her daily routine. Finally, after having given Mother all this, I went to bed feeling that at last I had a handle on her medication. Mother was up in the night every hour, unable to speak, unable to stand, wanting the loo, and unable to get herself even into a sitting position. In the morning, she could barely speak and could not open her eyes properly. She mumbled, trying to say something, but couldn't. Alexia said to call the doctor. The carer came and told me it wouldn't be long now. Mother asked for a cup of tea and tried to speak again. "Mother," I said, "don't talk. Rest. Conserve your energy." I called my brothers and told them that Mother had taken a turn for the worse. Everyone was coming. We all needed to be here. In the meantime, my nurse daughter had called the Macmillan nurse, and I, leaning over Mother to wipe her dribbling mouth, heard what she was trying to say. "It's the medication," she whispered. "The medication." Our Macmillan nurse arrived, looked very carefully at Mother, scanned the medication basket, sat down and asked me what I had been doing. It turns out that a full oral syringe of Oromorph was probably enough to knock out an elephant. I had not noticed that there were 2 different sizes of oral syringe. One was 5 millimeters and one was 10. Mother needed 2.5. I had simply filled whatever one I had picked up and had dosed my mother to the eyeballs with morphine. The very strong anti-sickness tablets were also utterly knockout, and only 1/4 of a tiny pill was needed every night. The instructions for half in the evening and half in the morning were too much, and the morphine patch on top of this, plus the long-standing nightly prescribed sleeping pill, had sent Mum into a whole different universe. Mother took 48 hours to come back to us, by which time we were reassured all her symptoms were well and truly under control. Our Macmillan nurse was very nice and said that sometimes mistakes were made, and in this case no harm was done. I was guided in detail with notes and instructions by Alexia as to exactly how much medication was needed and when it was to be taken. I was instructed to learn each of the names on the boxes and to remember the dosage and test it on it hourly. When my brothers arrived, they were relieved that Mother was not going to die just yet, and had proved how strong she was at her core by withstanding a morphine and medical tidal wave, and despite not having long to live with an aggressive cancer, coming back from the experience unharmed.